What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes. In this video, we're going to be working on creating a Stripe payment system using Apollo Server, React, and Apollo Client. First, we're going to set up the Stripe API credentials and create a test product for our site to sell. We're then going to create an Apollo Server backend with full payment processing routes. Then we're going to create the React and Apollo Client frontend that has full checkout functionality with full payments and also logic for canceling payments and showing successful payments to the user. Let's get started by running through what the end project's going to look like. So this is the final project. It's relatively simple. There's going to be a home screen of some sort with a checkout button. The checkout button connects to Stripe itself and is connected to a product that we're selling. We can then process the payment using some test data provided by Stripe. This is not my actual credit card. And on a successful payment, the website is going to go to the success route and show thank you for your purchase. When we go over to our Stripe payments library for the account I'm connected to, you'll see that we have a purchase that was just processed 1 minute ago. From the payments page, you're able to see all the different relevant information related to a certain payment. Alright, so this is showing you guys the full system. It's not supposed to be super comprehensive because we're going to get into all that stuff later in the video. So let's get started by creating our Stripe account. So we can go to stripe.com and sign in. From this page, you're going to want to sign up, enter in your information, and press create account. From here, you're going to see your main Stripe dashboard. The important thing you want to save here is this secret key over here. The secret key is necessary for working with the test APIs and creating test logic so you don't make an actual, $100 payment that you have to pay yourself just to test your API out. So make sure to copy this secret key. I'm going to be talking about it later in the video when we create the backend. At the top here, I'm then going to press products. We're then going to create a test product so we have something to purchase using our test API. So press add a product. And so there's a bunch of different things you can kind of change around here when it comes to creating a product. I'm just going to create a very simple product that is a one-time payment, and I'm going to set it to a price of $10. As you guys will see, there are a lot of different other pricing options. You can look into what makes sense for your situation. But for this video, we're going to keep it simple, make a product name, choose standard pricing, make it like $10. And again, we're using a test API, so you're never going to get charged. Once you're done with this, just press save product right here. And now we will have a created product. An API ID gets associated with a certain product. So if I reference this API ID right here in my backend code, it's going to recognize that it's connected to this Cooper Codes channel. That's how it gets all of your information for a certain product, is through this API ID. And so for now, that is all we need to do for Stripe. Let's get started by creating the Apollo Server backend code. All right, so this tutorial assumes that you have Node.js installed. If you don't have it installed, just go look up Node.js install. It should be relatively simple. We're going to start by creating a Package.json for our backend to use to kind of handle all the different Stripe packages and also all the different Apollo Server packages. We can do that by saying npm init -- yes. This is just going to initialize a Package.json with all the default values. We can now install all the dependencies that our backend code is going to need. We're going to need to install Express, and then Apollo-server-express. I'm also going to install cores, which is going to help us add extra security to calling our backend. And I'm also going to add Stripe, which is the Stripe library for processing payments. All right, so your package.json should look something like this. I'm going to go into these scripts here, and I'm going to create a start script for us to start our server with. We're not going to be using this for a while, but while we're here, we might as well create it. It's just going to run a file called server.js using Node. So make sure you save that, and let's create that server.js file now. Server.js is where we're going to build all the functionality for our Apollo server. We can start by grabbing all the objects we need from our packages. For example, I need cores. So I'm going to say const cores is equal to require cores. We also need Express to create an Express web server, which I'll talk about more in a second, and we can say require Express. Importantly, we're going to need two packages from Apollo server. So the main one is Apollo server like this, and then GQL, which is a graph querying language. I'm going to require Apollo server express here like that. Very important is we're going to require Stripe now. So I'm going to say const Stripe is equal to require Stripe, and this require Stripe needs a key to be initialized. So go back to your Stripe dashboard, and then you're going to want to grab your secret key. So copy this key here and then bring it back to your code. This secret key allows Stripe to recognize that when we make requests from our backend, they are specifically related to your store or your Stripe account. I'm also going to save the domain of our front end in a variable because we're going to be using it a lot throughout the Stripe setup and also the core setup. So I'm going to say frontend underscore domain, and I'm going to use that all caps syntax because this is a const. We don't want this to change. For this video, we're going to be hosting on localhost 3000. If you're hosting on an actual website, for example, you can make this like, facebook.com or whatever. And so now I'm going to create the function that is going to hold all of our Apollo server setup code. I'm going to make this an asynchronous anonymous function, which is very common for a lot of the Apollo server setups. This is because Apollo server itself requires the await keyword when starting up. For example, you would say something like await server.start. And to use the await keyword, you need to be in an asynchronous function. We make the function anonymous because it's only ever going to show up once, and this is kind of just like a startup function if you can imagine. There's no reason for us to call this anywhere else. And so the code I have right here is defining the function. If we want to call it, we do two little function calls at the end. This means that we're going to run whatever code is right here. I'm going to start our backend code by defining the type defs and the resolvers that we're going to need for our Apollo server. This video is intentionally very simplistic. We're only going to have one query and it's only going to check out one item. If you're interested in possibly a full e-commerce store where the IDs of the items you're buying change or you have different carts, let me know. So for our type defs, we're going to define a query. So we can say const type defs is equal to GQL with two backticks. Within these two backticks means that we're going to start writing GraphQL code. For example, we can say type query, and the name of our query is going to be create checkout session, and it's going to return a string. This string is going to return a JSON.stringify where it's going to show the actual Stripe URL right here. And so this little string is going to get sent to our front end, and then the front end is going to redirect the user to the Stripe URL. But I'm just kind of mentioning that for now so you guys know why it's returning a string. Let's get into the actual logic behind this query. We can define the query logic by making a resolvers object. So we can say const resolvers is equal to, and since we want to define a query here, we can now say query, and we can now say create checkout session. And make sure you spell that the same way. After the colon here, we're going to define the function that create checkout session represents. Since we're using an Apollo server resolver, we're going to have access to 4 different parameters. But in this case, we don't need to use any of them. But we also want to make our function asynchronous. So we can say async and empty parameters like this, and then use arrow syntax to say, after this arrow, within the curly braces is the logic of our backend. I know it's kind of strange that we don't have any parameters here, but just for this resolver, we don't need to use any of them. We have no parameters coming in from the query. We don't need access to the parent object, which is the first parameter, and we don't need access to anything else. All right, so now we're finally getting past the setup and going to get into some real code. So with Stripe, they want you to create a session for your user to pretty much pay with. We can do this by saying const session is equal to await. This is why it's important to say sync, by the way, is because we're using await for Stripe. And then we can use the Stripe object, which they give us. So stripe.checkout.sessions.create. This allows us to create a user session with a certain set amount of objects. So line underscore items is something defined by Stripe, and it's going to be an array of all the items we want the user to check out with. These items are defined within JavaScript objects like this. And they have a bunch of different options you can use, but the main two ones are the price of the product and then the quantity of the product. So within this price here, we can actually reference that API ID I was talking about before. So let's go back to our Stripe dashboard. So in our Stripe dashboard, we can then go to products and we can go to the product that we created. From here, we can copy this API ID down here at the price. We can then copy this API ID into the price here. This is especially interesting because instead of saying like directly we want it to be $10, we can reference an actual product by using the API ID that Stripe gives us. For this checkout session, we're only going to have one product that we use. And this mode is going to be a payment mode. There are other modes you can look into. If you're curious what the other modes are, you can just look into checkout sessions documentation mode. That Google will probably get you somewhere. And Stripe gives us some options to send the user to a certain URL if they had a successful payment or if they canceled their payment. Because an interesting thing about this session is at the end of the day, the interesting thing about session is that once all this code is fully set up, session is going to give us access to a session.url. This is the URL that the user gets forwarded to in order to make a Stripe payment. And so it's going to be stripe.com/the checkout with your product, whatever it is at the end of the day. And so this is how we can send the user to go make a payment, is we say, okay, we want to fully initialize the session and what products they're paying for. And then at the end of the day, this session is going to be like, okay, we're Stripe, we registered your session, and now here's the link for your user to use. And Stripe is also smart in that it creates these links on the fly. And so it can redirect your user to a certain link is kind of why I bring this up. For example, if a user makes a successful payment, Stripe will let you know about that but under the success_URL property. It'll be like, if Stripe recognizes your payment as successful, we can send them to a certain URL. And so I'm going to use that frontend domain const, and I'm going to add the /success route to the end of it. And we're going to handle these routes over in React. And I'm also going to use the cancel_URL, which is going to be the front-end domain plus \cancel. And so just to give an idea of what these are creating is we're going to have the actual domain that we have above and saved in our const. For example, our localhost 3000, which is where our React's going to be hosted on, plus /success. And so this is going to give us localhost 3000 /success. So we can redirect our user to that link. You can imagine if you were a real website, you could say like facebook.com/success or like yourstore.com/success. I'm kind of going over everything in fine detail there because we're almost done. We're just going to return a JSON.stringify of an object that we're going to send to our front end. So this object is just going to be a string that our front end can then process into JSON, and it's going to be a URL.session.url. And it's going to have a URL property, which we are going to define as session.url. And then similar to what I mentioned above, this is going to return a string like this, where it's going to have a URL property referencing the Stripe URL. Because one thing about Apollo server that, maybe it's why you even came to the tutorial is all the Stripe documentation uses Express just by itself. The thing about Apollo server Express is that you can't redirect your users directly. So you have to send the URL to your front end, then have the front end do the redirecting is something that can be kind of hard to understand. And I'm going to show you guys that full logic throughout this video. I'm going to clean up some of these comments here, and we have the full query set up. This is the amazing thing about Stripe is, how simple it is. Although the setup especially for Apollo server is not so simple. So don't worry, I got you guys. Now we can actually get into setting up our Express server and our Apollo server. So let's do that. So we can make a const app equal to Express. This is pretty much just saying, I want to start running a web server. And so this is the server that your Apollo server is going to be built on top of, if that makes sense. And this is part of the Express documentation. They want you to app.use express.static public. This is just necessary to get some of the Stripe functionality to work. I'm also going to introduce cores to this application. I'm trying to make this tutorial as simple as possible, but cores is especially important for when you're dealing with, like finance related things. It's nice to know that the only requests to your API are going to be coming from the store that you want them to come from, for example. So I'm going to make a little cores options block here, and I'm going to tell them I only want the origins to my, Express server to be from frontend_domain. And I'm also going to set credentials to true. This is just so you can send cookies back and forth, so it's not important, but it's just nice to have, and it also doesn't break our application. It actually adds more functionality if you guys are building something even larger on top of this Apollo server. And so in order to set up the cores with the cores options, we can then say app.use. So our Express server is going to use cores with the certain cores options that we defined right here. And this is saying, for our case, we only want requests to be coming from HTTP localhost 3000. And so if I'm over on localhost 5000, I'm like, I want to buy something. We're going to be like, nope, you can only buy it from our stores page. Okay, and so that gets the Express stuff set up. And now we're going to set up the actual Apollo server, which I'm going to say const server is equal to the new Apollo server. When you start an Apollo server, it's going to require you to define those type defs. I'm kind of being clever here. We've already made the type defs. And we've already made the resolvers. And so there you go. Super great. And that's all we need to do. Apollo server makes it super simple once you create those type defs and resolvers logic. I'm then going to use await to give our server some time to start. So await server.start. I'm also going to make a little console log to let us know where we're at. I'm going to say server started. Just in case, something breaks, we'll get a good idea of where we are. That's pretty good practice. And I'm also going to await server.apply middleware. I'm just going to make some basic middleware that pretty much forces cores to happen on the Apollo side as well. We want to apply it to app, which is our Express server here. So I'm going to say /GraphQL to allow us to make HTTP requests. And so we also want to do some enabling of the cores here as well. This is just some code that's necessary to allow us to make HTTP requests to our server. I would say for this tutorial, don't worry about it. This is just some setup to make sure you guys are fully secure with payments. In order to actually start our Express server, we're going to say app.listen. This is going to allow it to accept requests on, I'm going to say for this tutorial, port 4000 is where our backend is going to live. We then get access to a callback function here, which I always kind of do this in my tutorials. I'm going to make a very basic console.log. Server is ready at localhost, we can say HTTP, localhost 4000. And then I'm just going to add the server.graphql path. Amazing. I know that's like a lot of steps. So if you guys didn't fully understand something, that's totally okay. But we can go into our console and then npm start. And amazing. If you see that your server is ready at localhost 4000 /GraphQL, you're good to go. Congratulations, your backend is fully set up. And so here's where things get interesting. We can now get started by creating the React and Apollo client frontend. So I'm going to say npx create-react-app. I'm going to name it client. All right, so once that is done, we can cd into our client. And now we are in the React application for our website. Let's head over to the source folder and go to index.js just to give us an idea of where we're going to be coding. We're going to start by installing two packages we're going to need for our React frontend. We're going to npm install at apollo/client. That's the Apollo client that I keep talking about, so we can make requests to our Apollo server. Then I also need react-router-dom. This allows us to route requests to, /success or, /canceled or just the main homepage. So that's going to be helpful when working with Stripe. All right, I'm just going to clear my console now, and let's take a look at index.js. We're going to start by fully initializing our Apollo client to be able to talk to our Apollo server, and then also passing it to our React app is an important part of this. So I'm going to import a couple libraries from Apollo client, Apollo client, in-memory cache. Apollo provider allows us to give the Apollo code to React, and also create HTTP link, which allows us to talk to that /GraphQL. So let's go and make that link then. Let's go to const link is equal to create HTTP link. And I want the URI of the link. So where's this link going to point to be HTTP localhost 4000 /GraphQL. I'm also going to do credentials include. That's not necessary for this tutorial, but it's how I set up the backend. So then we're going to initialize the actual Apollo client. Now that we have a link for it to use, we can start by saying const client is equal to new Apollo client. We're going to make the cache for our Apollo client the simple new in-memory cache. This is kind of like the default cache that they expect you to use. And we're going to set the link equal to that link we just made at line 13. Amazing. And so now the one thing we haven't used, Apollo provider, we're going to go down here, bring the Apollo provider object in. We're going to take our app here and we're going to put it inside the Apollo provider. And then we want the app to know that the client it should be using is going to be equal to the client object that we created line 18. So whenever we make requests to our Apollo server, it's going to be using the client defined right here. I'm going to go and create 3 different pages for our front end to use. You can imagine the home page, the success page, and then the user made a cancellation to their payment page. So I'm just going to save all these in a folder called pages. So the first one is going to be home.js, which is where, that home screen is. Then we're going to have cancel.js, which is if they cancel a payment, it'll send them to that link. So it could be like, oh, sorry, you cancel your payment, something like that. And then also success.js. So this is on a successful payment. We want to show some code. We can go over to our app.js. I'm going to delete everything in the header here But I'm going to do a little cheating to make our life easier. Is we can go in here, copy all this code, and just make some very basic pages for our React application to use. So let's get started by creating the cancellation page. We're not going to need logo.svg anymore. And a super important part of this is we want this to be /app.css. This is because we're in one folder, and so we have to go ... to get out one folder. You can imagine like this. We are the cancel code here. I'm going to go out a folder, and then I want to go to this app.css here. Is kind of what's happening there. So that second dot lets us go out the folder and then look at app.css. I'm then going to name this component cancel. So name it cancel here and make sure you also export cancel on the bottom. I'm just going to make an obvious large header saying, sorry to see you canceled your payment. Hopefully you find what you're looking for. All right, so this isn't Cooper codes anymore. This is Cooper becomes a customer service agent. So now we got some nice message for the user to see if they cancel. And so copy all this cancel code, and I'm going to go and do success next. Change the name of your component to success, and also make sure to export success as well. And I'm just going to say your payment was processed successfully. Thanks for shopping with us. This goes without saying, but whatever your store is, you want it to say something related to your store, and you can make this page as nice as you want as well. These are just incredibly basic routes. And then I'm going to go to home.js, and I'm going to do the same thing. Just take all the success code, cancel code, take the whole component, copy it, and then paste it here. Make these components just the home thing. And I'm just going to say, welcome to our store. We're going to need a checkout button to eventually be here. I'm going to do the checkout button code after we get all the routing code correctly, so we can jump from cancel to home to success. And so I'm just putting this little paragraph here to show that we're eventually going to have a checkout button that we need to create. So now we can go over to app.js and create the router for our application to use. We're going to start by importing all the different pages our application needs. First one we're going to import is cancel, like this. And if you're on VS Code, it should actually autofill all these, which is nice. We're then going to import home, and we're then going to import success. And so the app here is kind of going to become a router. It's not going to be an actual page anymore. We want the application to route to a certain page. For example, we route to home or we route to success just to show different data. We can do that by using React Router. React Router allows us to show different React pages based on different pages. For example, localhost 3000/success is going to be linked to the success component. And just localhost 3000 by itself is going to be linked to the home component. React Router is what allows us to make those routes. And so let's go up here and start importing everything we need from React Router. I'm going to say import browser router as just regular router, just so it makes the naming more simple when we code it out. And we're also going to need routes and route. And as we code this out, I will explain what's happening. And these are all going to be coming from the React Router DOM package we installed earlier. So in order to create routing in your application, you need two very important things. A router that goes on the very outside of your application. So in this case, we're an app. This is kind of like the furthest out we can go. And we also need a routes component to store all the different routes we want our application to go to. For example, if we want to define a route that when you just go to localhost 3000, it points you to the home component we have above, we can do that by saying route path is equal to /, which means pretty much nothing at the end. It's just localhost by itself. We want it to go to a certain element. In our example, our element is more of a full page, but we can go in here, paste in the home component here. And now we have a fully defined route. If we go to localhost 3000 in our application, it will bring us to home. And so let's npm start and show you guys that. Whoa, very cool. So we have our welcome to our store, and eventually we're going to want to have that checkout button. But this is cool. This means that we are routing from the localhost regular / path here, and it's showing this home component. Pretty awesome. You'll see though, if we go to /success, there's nothing here, right? So we have to go and create those routes now. So you can copy your route here just to make your life easier. And let's make a route to /success, for example. And we want it to point to the success page like this. These elements are coming from where we imported them up here. And then if a user were to cancel a payment, for example, or cancel the process over on Stripe's end, the Stripe would say, oh, this person canceled. I'm going to send you to the cancel page from where you originated from, so our website. And so we can set the element equal to cancel. All right, and so in this video, I'm not doing like a nav bar or anything because it actually doesn't make sense. You wouldn't really want the user to look at the top and jump to the success page. But if we go to localhost 3000/success, your payment was processed successfully. Thanks for shopping with us. Localhost 3000/cancel, for example. Sorry to see you canceled your payment. Hopefully you find what you're looking for. Hoping the user buys your stuff again instead of leaving forever, right? But yeah, this is a great example. We now have 3 different routes, which is going to make our Stripe functionality more full. It's going to use every single aspect of Stripe that we can. One very important thing we have to create now is an actual button to check out. So we can create our checkout button by going into our source and then creating a checkout button.js. When creating this checkout button, it's important to realize that when we click on the button, that's when we want to send a request to our Apollo server to start the payment process. To start, if I click checkout, I want to be sent to the Stripe link, for example. So understanding that, we need to get all the tools we need to work with Apollo client. For the checkout button, I'm going to import GQL to make our graph querying language request and also use lazy query. I'm going to explain more about use lazy query in a second, but pretty much we have to query our server, but we want to do it in a lazy way, which I will explain in a second. And these are going to be coming from Apollo client. So we can get started by creating our actual checkout query. For this example, I'm just going to name it checkout in all caps. This is the query we're going to use to start the checkout session and pretty much allow the user to start checking out whatever's in their cart. Although we're not really making a cart system, but you know what I'm saying. And so the query is simple here. We're just going to say query and then query like this. We want to say, okay, what query do we want to call? We named it create checkout session. And remember, this query is going to give us a string, which is kind of what we're querying for data. Now that we have our checkout query ready to go, we can make a functional component here by saying function checkout button. I'm just going to make the export default now at the bottom so we don't miss out on it. Export default checkout button. I remember when I was a beginner, I had so many different errors that I would run into because I forgot to have an export default in the bottom. I was like, where's my component? So make sure you have that at line 13. I'm going to start by fully defining our query. So we're doing the hardest part first. We are using something called a lazy query. And so I'm just going to make some comments here. What is a lazy query? It's a query that doesn't get ran right away. Many queries are designed so that as soon as your page loads, you're running to get data as fast as possible. You could imagine like a social media website. As soon as you load up facebook.com, boom, you want the data on your page as fast as possible. A lazy query is different. It's like, we want data when the user checks out, for example. We want data when a user does a certain action. We don't need it right away. That's a great example of when to use a lazy query like we're going to do in this video. And so lazy queries in Apollo server use the use lazy query hook. The simple way to think about hooks in React is kind of giving you access to external functionality. And so use lazy query is a hook from Apollo client, allowing us to make a lazy query. And we're going to use the use lazy query with the checkout query that we created above. And so use lazy query is going to return us a couple things. And it's going to give us an array format. There are going to be 2 things in this array. The function we can call to actually execute the query. So I'm going to say start checkout, then all the different pieces of data that the regular use query in Apollo client gives us. So for example, it gives us a loading object, an error object, a data object, and that's all we need for this tutorial is loading, error, and data. And we're going to make an option here to run some code when the query gets completed. We're going to get data from our query, which I'm just going to call query data. I'm going to use a let data equal to json.parse because remember, this query data is going to show up in the format of URL, Stripe URL like this. JSON.parse actually creates this into a real JavaScript object that we can work with. So you guys see the difference here? This thing on the left is a string, which we got from our server. This thing on the right is an actual JavaScript object, 2 completely different things. And so json.parse allows us to get query data from a specific query. For example, create checkout session was the name of our query. We can also just console.log the data here to show you guys that it's an actual object, for example. And then we can use another let statement to grab the checkout URL, which is given to us by our backend. And so that's going to be data.url, because you could imagine this data right here is becoming this object. Because it's an actual JavaScript object now, we can access the URL property by saying the name of the object, which is data.url. Now we're going to redirect the user to the checkout URL that Stripe gave us and that our backend gave us. We can do this by saying window.location.assign checkout URL. You could imagine if our checkout URL was, Stripe URL, they are going to be pushed over to Stripe URL. This window.location.assign is kind of like an old school way of doing it. There's like use, navigate, and other things. But this is like a surefire way to just like pretty much say, user, you are going to stripeurl.com. And it's pretty legit. It works for almost all browsers. And that's why it's also kind of cool. And that's why I use it for this tutorial, is it works for a bunch of different cases, which is important when you're trying to make a payment system for a lot of people. All right, so we got that full query made, which is pretty difficult part of the tutorial. So if you got this far, congrats guys, and thanks so much for watching, of course. Now we're gonna do some error handling. If there is anything in the loading object, we want to return null. If there is an error, we want to return some text talking about that error. So I'm just gonna say error, then do some little $sign syntax because we're using backticks. We can just console.log pretty much the entire error like this. If we get this far and we made it past both these if statements, it means that we probably have data. So we can say console.log data here just to see what that looks like. And now the actual component is we want to make a very simple button. So I'm going to make a return, which is our actual React component here. You just want to make a very simple button that starts the checkout for us. So we can literally just say button and just say checkout. And then when you click the button, so on click, we can then pass it to call a function. And what do we want it to do? Well, we want to call this function that's given to us by the useLazy query. All right, so this is pretty awesome. We have pretty much made a full system where we click on a button and it gets data from our backend. And then when our backend data gets completed, we send the user to the Stripe URL that got created on the backend. So we get a full system here, which is super cool to see. In order to test this, we need to run both the backend and the frontend at the same time. A super cool thing about VS Code is it allows you to split terminals. On the left, I'm in my client here, even though it's kind of like messing up. 1 second. On my left, I'm on the client here. So I can say npm start to get our client going. And let's see, I might have made a mistake somewhere. We'll see. Very cool. So our client's running. And then I can go over to our backend and we can say npm start, get the backend running. Boom, it's up and going. So let's go to our homepage and then add the checkout button. Just to add some extra clarity, we can grab the checkout button because at the bottom it's saying export default checkout button here. So let's run over to our home page and we're going to ask to import that button we just made. So import checkout button. It's going .. because it's going back one directory and then grabbing the checkout button here. So instead of this paragraph, we can get rid of that and then we can just use the component we just made by doing this. So go back to your React app and amazing, we now have an actual checkout button. Yep, and this is why it's super great to show the errors, is I actually was kind of planning on this error to show up, is we want to actually make an account or business name. So go to this link that it recommends here. So I'm going to make my account name Cooper Codes, but trust me, this is not going to be my real account, so don't do anything dumb. We can save the account like this, boom. Now, once you're good to go there, once you press the save button, it recognizes you as a user. You can now refresh your React application. All right, so if you guys were coding along, I actually said session with 3 S's over here, which was wrong. So it wasn't getting the data out of it correctly. Get rid of one of those S's, but hopefully you were smarter than I and was like, oh, this guy's got 3 S's in there. But once you refresh your React app, you should be good to go now. So let's go back and check out. All right, so it's going to show the item you're buying and then how much it costs. Enter in your information here. And so for my case, I'm just doing this Visa test card where it's a bunch of 42, 42, 42, 42. This is a test card provided by Stripe. If you look up Stripe test cards, you'll get sent to this page eventually where it's stripe.com/docs/testing. If you need to, try out a different region or try out, MasterCard as opposed to Visa, for example, all these different cards here are accessible and usable through test APIs. So, if you want to try out an American Express payment, use this card number here. And as you'll see, the CVC can be any digits and any date for all of them, I believe. So as long as you get this number right, you have a test payment you can make. And so I'm just going to put the year in the future, do some random numbers here, make a random zip code, and then I'm able to pay right now. And so it says your payment was processed successfully. Thanks for shopping with us. So this is pretty cool. Importantly, you can go run back over to your Stripe dashboard. So go back to the dashboard and we can go to payments. And you should see a payment that got processed from, your recent customer. And so this is pretty cool. This is an example of the full process of using the Stripe API, especially when it comes to Apollo server. Something that was lacking in the Stripe documentation was any mention of Apollo. All the different example codes were just showing straight Express servers with no Apollo or GraphQL functionality. So hopefully this video was helpful when it came to creating that type of functionality. If this video was helpful to you, please drop a subscribe, drop a like, comment, or something like that. It honestly helps with the channel. I know a lot of YouTubers say that, but these videos are crazy to make. You kind of got to do a full project. And so, thanks so much for watching if you did make it this far. And yeah, thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.